Picture this. You're sitting in a cramped wooden box, barely 6 feet wide, with your entire life packed around you. The wheels beneath you groan and crack over rocks the size of your fist. Your children haven't had a proper meal in 3 days. The oxen are dying, and you still have 800 miles to go. This isn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday for hundreds of thousands of American families in the 1800s. They called it manifest destiny. They called it the American dream. But what they lived through, that was something else entirely. Between 1841 and 1869, over 400,000 people loaded everything they owned into covered wagons and rolled west across a continent that seemed determined to kill them. Most of us imagine romantic scenes of pioneers singing around campfires under starlit skies. The reality was far more brutal, far more desperate, and far stranger than anything Hollywood ever dared to show you. Today, we're uncovering 13 facts about covered wagon travel that will change everything you thought you knew about America's westward expansion. Facts so harsh, so unforgiving, that they'll make you wonder how anyone survived at all. And here's the thing that might disturb you most. Many of them didn't. And fact 1. The myth of speed. Let's start with the biggest misconception of all. When you think of covered wagons racing across the plains, you probably picture them moving at a decent clip, maybe like a horse at a trot. But here's the brutal truth. Most wagon trains moved at exactly 2 miles per hour. That's slower than your normal walking pace. Imagine leaving your house right now and walking to your neighbor's place down the street. That leisurely stroll, that's faster than families traveled for months across some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. A typical day's journey covered 15 to 20 miles if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, and luck was often in short supply, they might make 5 miles, or none at all. Why so slow? The answer reveals just how misunderstood these journeys really are. These weren't race cars. They were moving houses, loaded with everything a family needed to start a new life. Furniture, farming tools, food for months, sometimes even pianos. A fully loaded wagon could weigh over 2,500 pounds. The oxen pulling these mobile homes weren't breaking any speed records. They were just trying not to collapse. But here's what makes this speed even more terrifying. Every mile per hour mattered. The journey from Missouri to Oregon took 4 to 6 months under ideal conditions. Start too late in the spring, and you'd hit the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter snow that could trap you for months. Leave too early, and there wouldn't be enough grass on the plains to feed your animals. The window of survival was razor thin. And those 2 miles per hour, that assumed everything went right. When things went wrong, and they often did, families found themselves stuck in the same spot for days or weeks, watching their supplies dwindle and their departure window closing like a trap. Fact 2. The walking reality. Here's another myth that needs to die. The idea that families rode comfortably inside their covered wagons like passengers in some Wild West taxi. The truth is far more exhausting. Most people walked for months. Think about that for a moment. Pregnant women walked from Missouri to California. Children as young as 5 walked 20 miles a day across terrain that would challenge modern hikers with the best equipment money can buy. Elderly grandparents, who could barely make it up a flight of stairs, walked over mountain passes that claimed the lives of healthy adults. Why didn't they ride? Because the wagons were already overloaded, and every extra pound meant the difference between making it over the next hill or watching your oxen collapse from exhaustion. The wagons were for supplies, not people. Riding was a luxury reserved for the sick, the injured, and small children who couldn't keep up. But walking across the American frontier wasn't like taking a stroll through your local park. This was walking across deserts where the sun could kill you, and winters that froze people solid in their sleep. This was walking through territories where getting lost meant death, where a twisted ankle could doom your entire family. Mary Ackley, who made the journey in 1852, wrote in her diary, "My feet are so sore and swollen, I can barely stand. But stand I must. The wagon cannot carry me, and our winter supplies both." She walked over 1,500 miles in shoes that fell apart halfway through the journey. Women walked while pregnant and gave birth on the trail, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, with no doctor for hundreds of miles. Then they got up and kept walking. Children walked until their feet bled, then walked some more. The elderly walked until they literally couldn't take another step. And then, often, they died. Fact 3. The death statistics. Let's talk about the numbers that will keep you up at night. The Oregon Trail, the most famous of the Western routes, stretched 2,170 miles from Missouri to Oregon. Along that trail, researchers estimate there's one grave for every 80 yards. Read that again. Every 80 yards. For over 2,000 miles. That means if you walked the Oregon Trail today, you'd pass a gravesite every minute or two. The entire route was basically a 2,000-mile cemetery, marked by wooden crosses, piles of stones, and hastily carved headstones that told stories of dreams that ended in the middle of nowhere. The death rate was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that 1 in 10 travelers died on the trail. But some historians believe the real number was much higher, especially when you factor in people who died shortly after arriving from injuries or illnesses contracted during the journey. What killed them? Disease was the biggest killer by far. Cholera alone claimed thousands of lives. The disease could kill a healthy adult in less than 24 hours. And it spread through wagon trains like wildfire. One morning, you'd wake up feeling fine. By evening, you could be dead. Families would bury their loved ones beside the trail and keep moving, because stopping meant risking everyone else's life. But disease was just the beginning. People drowned crossing rivers. They were crushed under wagon wheels. They were struck by lightning, bitten by snakes, killed by wild animals, and murdered by other travelers driven to desperation. Some simply gave up, overwhelmed by the brutality of the journey, and walked away from their wagons into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The Donner Party is the most famous example of how wrong things could go. But they weren't unique. Dozens of wagon trains disappeared completely. Entire families vanished without a trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and questions that will never be answered. Fact 4. The reality of living in a wagon. Now let's talk about what it was actually like to live in these covered wagons for months at a time. Imagine the smallest apartment you've ever seen. Now cut it in half. Now imagine sharing that space with 6 to 10 people for 4 to 6 months, with no privacy, no bathroom, and no way to escape. The average covered wagon was 11 feet long and 4 feet wide. The usable living space was even smaller because most of the wagon was packed with supplies. Families of 8 or 10 people shared a space roughly the size of a modern walk-in closet. They slept in this space, ate in this space, lived in this space, through blazing summers and freezing winters. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Married couples couldn't be intimate. Children couldn't play. Adults couldn't have private conversations. Every argument, every moment of despair, every family crisis played out in front of everyone else in a space so small you could touch both sides by stretching your arms out. The smell was overwhelming. Picture 10 people who haven't bathed in months, living in a confined space with no ventilation, eating beans and salt pork that often went bad in the heat. Add the smell of unwashed clothes, dirty children, and chamber pots that couldn't always be emptied when you wanted to. The stench inside these wagons was so intense that many people preferred to sleep outside, even in dangerous territory. Temperature control was impossible. In summer, the canvas tops turned the wagons into ovens that could reach temperatures over 120 degrees. In winter, they became ice boxes where water froze solid and people woke up with frost on their blankets. The canvas provided almost no insulation from heat, cold, wind, or rain. And here's a detail that really drives home how desperate these journeys were. Many families were so cramped that they took turns sleeping. Some people slept during the day while others drove. Some slept under the wagon. Some didn't really sleep at all for months at a time. Food was supposed to last for months, but here's what the guidebooks didn't tell you. Most of it went bad, ran out, or became inedible long before you reached your destination. Families were advised to bring 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 20 pounds of sugar, and 10 pounds of salt per person. That sounds like a lot until you realize it had to last for 4 to 6 months of hard physical labor in extreme conditions. And that's assuming none of it spoiled, got wet, was stolen, or had to be abandoned when the wagon became too heavy for dying animals to pull. The reality was far grimmer. Bacon turned rancid in the heat. Flour became infested with insects or turned moldy when wagons leaked in rainstorms. Sugar dissolved into sticky messes that attracted every fly and ant for miles. Fresh vegetables were a fantasy after the first few weeks. Most families ended up surviving on what they called trail bread, a mixture of flour and water that was more like hardtack than actual bread. They ate beans that were often undercooked because fuel was scarce and fires were dangerous in windy conditions. They ate salt pork that was so salty it burned your mouth and made you desperately thirsty in places where clean water was hard to find. But here's where it gets really dark. When food ran out, which happened more often than anyone wants to admit, families faced impossible choices. Do you kill the oxen that are pulling your wagon, giving you meat, but stranding you in the wilderness? Do you abandon your possessions to make room for more food supplies if you can find them? Do you send your fastest walker ahead to settlements to buy supplies, knowing they might never find their way back? Some families resorted to eating their leather goods, belts, shoes, anything made of hide. Others ate grass, tree bark, and roots that sometimes made them violently sick. The Donner Party's turn to cannibalism gets all the attention, but historians believe other trapped groups faced similar desperate choices that were simply never recorded or talked about. Martha Morrison, traveling in 1844, wrote, "We have been without proper food for 6 days. The children cry constantly from hunger. I gave my youngest daughter my leather gloves to chew on. What kind of mother have I become?" Fact 6. Water, the silent killer. Water seems like it should have been everywhere on a journey across a continent. But clean, safe drinking water was often harder to find than gold. And contaminated water killed more travelers than Indian attacks, wild animals, and accidents combined. Rivers and streams weren't the pristine water sources you might imagine. They were often contaminated with animal waste, dead animals, and runoff from other wagon trains that had passed through before you. Alkali springs, common in the Western Territories, looked like fresh water, but could cause severe illness or death if consumed. Some water sources were so alkaline they could burn your throat and cause violent diarrhea that led to fatal dehydration. But travelers had no choice but to drink whatever water they could find. Water purification wasn't really understood, and even if it was, families couldn't spare the fuel to boil all their drinking water. They drank from stagnant ponds, muddy streams, and water barrels that grew algae and breeding insects during the long journey. The result was predictable. Waterborne diseases swept through wagon trains like plagues. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever killed thousands of people who had survived every other challenge the trail could throw at them. People would drink from a contaminated source in the morning and be dead by evening. Here's a particularly chilling detail. Many of the graves along the Oregon Trail were dug near water sources because that's where the sickest people stopped and couldn't go any further. Some springs and river crossings were surrounded by so many graves that travelers called them boneyards. Imagine being desperately thirsty and finding a water source surrounded by dozens of graves from people who died after drinking from it. Do you risk it, or do you keep going and hope you find something safer before you die of thirst? The answer, for most families, was to drink and pray. They didn't have a choice. Fact 7. Weather, nature's cruelest test. The weather didn't just make the journey uncomfortable. It was actively trying to kill you, and it succeeded more often than anyone cared to count. Summer temperatures on the plains could reach 110 degrees or higher, turning the wagons into mobile furnaces and the ground into surfaces hot enough to burn through shoe soles. People suffered heat stroke, severe dehydration, and sunburns that turned into infected wounds. Water supplies dwindled faster in the heat, and animals collapsed from exhaustion. But winter was even worse. Travelers who got caught in early snowstorms faced a death sentence. The Donner Party is famous for being trapped by snow, but they weren't the only ones. Entire wagon trains disappeared in blizzards, their remains found months later, frozen in positions that told stories of final, desperate moments. Thunderstorms on the open plains were terrifying experiences that modern people can barely imagine. With nowhere to hide and metal wagon parts that acted like lightning rods, travelers were sitting ducks for electrical storms that could kill instantly. Lightning strikes were recorded in dozens of trail diaries, and many graves were marked simply, "Struck by lightning." But perhaps the most brutal weather phenomenon was the hailstorm. Hail on the plains could be as large as eggs or even larger, falling with enough force to kill animals and injure people. Wagons offered little protection from hailstones that could smash through canvas tops and wooden boards. Families caught in severe hailstorms sometimes emerged with head injuries, broken bones, and trauma that lasted the rest of their lives. Wind was another constant enemy. Prairie winds could blow for days at hurricane strength, making it impossible to light fires for cooking or warmth. Dust storms could last for hours, filling wagons with choking dust and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. People got lost in dust storms and wandered in circles until they died of thirst, just yards from their wagons. Floods could appear without warning, turning gentle streams into raging torrents that swept away wagons, animals, and people. The Platte River, which seemed shallow and harmless most of the time, became a killer during flash floods that caught travelers by surprise. Fact 8. The animal tragedy. The oxen, mules, and horses that pulled these wagons weren't just transportation. They were the difference between life and death. And watching them suffer and die was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the journey. Most families started with teams of 4 to 6 oxen or mules. These animals had to pull thousands of pounds across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, often with inadequate food and water. The daily strain was enormous. Animals that were healthy and strong at the beginning of the journey became walking skeletons after months on the trail. The Oregon Trail is littered with the bones of dead animals. Historians estimate that for every human grave, there are 20 animal graves. Some sections of the trail were so thick with animal bones that travelers used them as landmarks. Turn left at the big pile of ox bones was actual directions people gave each other. But here's what makes this even more tragic. Families became emotionally attached to their animals. These weren't just beasts of burden. They were partners in survival, with names and personalities. Children grew up with these animals. Adults depended on them not just for transportation, but for emotional support during the darkest moments of the journey. When an animal became too sick or injured to continue, families faced a horrible choice. Do you shoot your faithful ox and put it out of its misery, knowing that losing that animal might doom your family? Do you abandon it to die slowly in the wilderness? Do you try to nurse it back to health while your food runs out and your departure window closes? Sarah Cummins wrote in 1845, "Our ox Tom has been with us since Missouri. He has pulled us through mud, over mountains, across rivers. Today he cannot stand. My husband says we must shoot him." How do you kill a member of your family? Many animals simply worked themselves to death. They pulled until their hearts gave out, collapsing in their traces and dying where they fell. Others were abandoned when they became too weak to keep up, left to die alone on the prairie. The sounds of dying animals calling out to their departing families haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Fact 9. The breakdown of civilization. Here's something the romanticized stories never mention. Months of extreme hardship, constant danger, and watching people die around you changes people. The civilized men and women who started the journey were often unrecognizable by the time they reached their destinations. Families that had been close became bitter enemies trapped in confined spaces. Marriages fell apart under pressure that few relationships could survive. Children stopped obeying parents who couldn't protect them from the horrors they witnessed daily. Communities that started as friends ended as suspicious strangers who would steal from each other to survive. Violence between travelers was more common than anyone wanted to admit. Men fought over water rights, camping spots, and shares of dwindling food supplies. Some fights ended in death, adding murder to the list of ways people died on the trail. Women fought too, sometimes with knives and guns, over perceived slights that would have been ignored in normal circumstances. Theft was epidemic. People stole food, tools, weapons, and even clothing from other families. Some travelers would sneak into camps at night and take whatever they could carry. Others would wait until families were distracted by illness or injury and then loot their wagons. The code of mutual assistance that was supposed to govern wagon trains broke down when survival was at stake. Mental illness was common but rarely discussed in the historical records. People suffering from what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress were described as having prairie fever or being touched by the sun. Some became catatonic. Others became violent. Many simply walked away from their wagons and were never seen again. Children were particularly affected. Many who survived the journey never fully recovered from what they had witnessed. They had seen their parents reduced to desperate animals. They had watched friends die horrible deaths. They had been forced to make adult decisions about life and death before they were 10 years old. The social fabric that held these traveling communities together was stretched beyond its breaking point. By the end of the journey, many wagon trains were collections of traumatized individuals who no longer trusted each other or believed in the civilized values they had started with. The American frontier wasn't just big, it was psychologically crushing in ways that broke people's minds before it broke their bodies. Imagine walking for days without seeing anything change. No trees, no hills, no landmarks of any kind, just endless grass stretching to the horizon in every direction. Many travelers developed what they called prairie madness, a form of psychological breakdown caused by the sheer, overwhelming vastness of the landscape. People got lost on the plains, even when following well-marked trails. The landscape was so featureless that travelers would walk in circles for days, thinking they were making progress when they were actually getting further from safety. Some families were found weeks later, dead in their wagons, just miles from where they had started wandering. But the plains were just the beginning. The real geographical horrors came in the mountains and deserts. The Sierra Nevada range was a death trap that claimed hundreds of lives. Families would reach the mountains already weakened by months of travel, only to face terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers with modern equipment. Mountain passes were often too narrow for wagons, forcing families to dismantle their wagons and carry pieces up steep slopes, piece by piece. The work was backbreaking, and many people died from exhaustion or falls. Others died when wagons broke loose and crushed people below. The deserts were equally deadly, but in different ways. The 40-mile desert in Nevada was aptly named. It was 40 miles of sand and alkali dust, with no water and no shade. Crossing it was like walking through hell. The sun was so intense, it could kill healthy adults in hours. The alkali dust was so fine, it got into everything: food, water, lungs. People died of thirst while carrying water that had become undrinkable from contamination. Some geographical features became legendary among travelers for all the wrong reasons. Devil's Gate in Wyoming was so narrow and dangerous that many wagons were destroyed trying to pass through it. Idalas on the Columbia River was where many families who had survived everything else finally met their end in the treacherous rapids. Here's a detail that shows how crushing the geography could be. Many travelers kept detailed diaries for the first part of their journey, describing the landscape and their experiences. But as the journey wore on and the landscape became more hostile, the entries became shorter and more desperate. Many diaries simply stop mid-journey, as if the writers had given up hope of ever reaching their destinations. Fact 11. The medical nightmare. Medical care on the trail wasn't just primitive. It was often more dangerous than no treatment at all, and the injuries and illnesses people faced would challenge modern emergency rooms. Most wagon trains had no doctor. Medical knowledge was limited to home remedies and folk cures that often made things worse. When someone was seriously injured or became critically ill, families faced impossible decisions with no good options. Broken bones were death sentences in many cases. Without proper medical care, fractures often became infected or healed incorrectly, leaving people crippled for life. Some people were abandoned when they became too injured to travel and too heavy to carry. Others were mercy killed by their own family members to end their suffering. And childbirth on the trail was often fatal for both mother and child. Women gave birth in the back of bouncing wagons, on the ground in terrible weather, with no medical assistance and no way to maintain sanitary conditions. Many babies died within days of birth. Many mothers died from complications that would be easily treatable today. But here's what makes the medical situation even more horrifying. Some of the treatments people used were actually deadly. Mercury was commonly used to treat various ailments, but mercury poisoning probably killed more people than it helped. Bloodletting was still practiced, which weakened people who were already struggling to survive. Opium-based medicines were used for everything from headaches to broken bones, leading to addiction and overdoses. Dental problems were excruciating and common. People pulled their own teeth with pliers or had them pulled by blacksmiths or other travelers with no medical training. Tooth infections could be fatal, and many people died from abscesses that spread to their brains. Mental health issues were completely misunderstood. People suffering from severe depression or anxiety were often restrained or abandoned. Some were tied to wagons to prevent them from wandering off. Others were left behind when their families decided they were too much of a burden to carry. The irony is that many of the people who died from medical problems on the trail would have survived easily with modern medical care. A simple antibiotic could have saved thousands of lives. Basic surgical procedures could have healed injuries that became death sentences. But in the 1800s, getting sick or injured on the trail was often the same as getting a death sentence. Fact 12. The financial ruin. Here's a brutal fact that most people don't know. Making the journey to the West often bankrupted families even if they survived. The cost of outfitting a wagon and supplies for the journey was enormous by 1800 standards, and most families went into debt that followed them for the rest of their lives. A basic wagon cost around $400 in 1850s money. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that $400 then would be worth about $15,000 today. Add in oxen, supplies for months, extra equipment, and emergency funds, and families were looking at costs equivalent to $25,000 to $30,000 in modern money. Most families had to sell everything they owned just to afford the basic supplies. They sold their farms, their homes, their furniture, their family heirlooms. They borrowed money from relatives and banks. Many started the journey already deep in debt, hoping to make enough money in the West to pay back what they owed. But the expenses didn't stop when the journey began. Equipment broke and had to be replaced at outrageous prices from trading posts that had monopolies on supplies. The simple axe that cost $1 in Missouri might cost $10 at a frontier trading post. Food that ran out or spoiled had to be replaced at whatever price merchants demanded. Many families were forced to abandon expensive possessions along the trail when their wagons became too heavy for their dying animals to pull. The Oregon Trail is littered with abandoned furniture, tools, and family treasures that represented huge financial investments. Families threw away pianos, china cabinets, and farming equipment that had cost them months of savings to buy. Here's the cruelest irony. Families who survived the journey often arrived at their destinations with nothing. They had spent everything they owned just to get there. Many had to work as laborers for other people for years before they could afford to buy land or start their own businesses. Some never recovered financially and lived in poverty for the rest of their lives. Others discovered that the promises of cheap, fertile land were lies. Much of the land available to settlers was of poor quality, or had already been claimed. Some families ended up as squatters on land they couldn't afford to buy. Others returned east, broke and defeated, after discovering that the American dream was a nightmare that had cost them everything they had. The financial pressure added another layer of desperation to an already desperate situation. Families couldn't turn back because they had no money to return home and no home to return to. They had to keep going west, no matter what happened, because they literally had nowhere else to go. Fact 13. The psychological toll. The final brutal fact is perhaps the most disturbing of all. The psychological damage from these journeys lasted for generations and changed American culture in ways we're still discovering. Survivors of wagon train journeys were traumatized in ways that we're only beginning to understand. They had witnessed horrors that most people never see in a lifetime, all compressed into a few months of constant terror. They had watched their children starve, their spouses die, their friends disappear. They had been forced to make choices no human being should ever have to make. Many survivors never talked about their experiences, even to their own families. The trauma was too intense, too personal, too horrifying to share with people who hadn't been there. Children grew up not knowing what their parents had endured to bring them west. The silence around these experiences created a mythology that was far more pleasant than the reality. But the psychological effects went deeper than individual trauma. Entire communities of survivors had been shaped by months of extreme hardship, violence, and death. They had learned not to trust others, not to rely on help, not to expect fairness or justice. These attitudes influenced how they built their new communities in the West. Some historians argue that the brutality of westward expansion created a particular type of American character: tough, independent, suspicious of outsiders, and comfortable with violence as a solution to problems. The idea that you had to be willing to do whatever it took to survive became part of the Western identity. Children who survived wagon train journeys grew up with a different relationship to death, suffering, and hardship than children who stayed in established communities. They had learned that life was fragile, that civilization was a thin veneer, and that you could lose everything in an instant. These lessons influenced how they raised their own children and built their communities. The psychological toll also extended to the families left behind. Wives, children, and parents who stayed in the East often never saw their loved ones again. Mail was unreliable, and many families simply disappeared somewhere between Missouri and the Pacific Ocean. The uncertainty and grief of not knowing what had happened to family members created a different kind of trauma that affected entire communities. So there you have it, 13 brutal facts about traveling the Old West in a covered wagon that reveal a reality far different from the romantic myths we've been told. This wasn't a grand adventure or a noble quest for freedom. This was a desperate gamble with odds that would make any sane person stay home. The people who made these journeys weren't heroes. They were ordinary families driven by circumstances, bad information, and hope that bordered on delusion. They endured things that would break most of us, and many of them didn't survive to tell their stories. But perhaps the most disturbing fact of all is this: they knew how dangerous it was. By the 1850s, the newspapers were full of stories about wagon trains that disappeared, families that died horrible deaths, and survivors who warned others not to make the same journey. But still they came, hundreds of thousands of them, loading their possessions into wooden boxes and rolling west toward an uncertain fate. What does that tell us about human nature, about the power of hope over reason? about what people will endure when they believe they have no other choice. The graves along the Oregon Trail have been weathered away by time, but the questions they raise about courage, desperation, and the price of dreams remain as relevant today as they were 150 years ago. In a world where we can fly across the continent in hours, it's worth remembering the people who walked every step of the way, paying a price in blood and tears that we can barely imagine. The next time someone talks about the good old days or the simple life of the past, remember the families trapped in wooden boxes, rolling slowly toward an uncertain future at 2 miles per hour. Remember the children who walked until their feet bled, the parents who watched their dreams die in the desert, and the thousands who never made it home. Because their stories deserve to be told. Not the sanitized, romanticized versions we've been fed, but the brutal truth about what it really cost to build the American West. The price was higher than anyone imagined, and someone had to pay it.